December 20th, 1943, RAF Mendlesham, England. A B-24 Liberator touches down after 7 hours over the Ruhr Valley. Technical Sergeant Mike Callahan climbs from the waist gun position, watching ground crews swarm the aircraft to count flak damage. 347 holes. Again, the bombardier, Lieutenant James Walsh, emerges from the nose compartment, his hands still shaking from the bomb run. For 28 minutes over Bremen, they'd flown straight and level while German 88mm shells turned the sky into a killing field of black smoke and shrapnel. Standard procedure. Hold course, maintain altitude, give the Norden bombsight time to calculate the perfect release point. 4 aircraft from their squadron hadn't come back. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But something different happened today. 30 seconds. Before bombs away, Walsh's gloved hands had gripped a canvas sack filled with aluminum strips. Following orders he barely understood, he'd torn it open and shoved the contents through the flare chute. Hundreds of metallized paper strips, each exactly 27 centimeters long, tumbled into the slipstream and scattered across the frozen German sky. The radar-directed flak that had been bracketing their formation with mathematical precision suddenly went silent. For 90 precious seconds, the German gun crews fired blind, while their Würzburg radar screens filled with phantom echoes. 90 seconds that let Walsh's crew come home. Callahan stares at the aluminum strips still clinging to his flight jacket, catching the weak December sunlight. The technique has a code name, window, borrowed from the British who'd been using it since July. But standing on English soil with ice crystals in his beard and the memory of exploding shells still fresh, Callahan doesn't care what they call it. He only knows one thing. For 18 months, American bomber crews have been dying over Germany at a rate that makes infantry combat look safe by comparison. The mathematics are brutally simple. 77% of crews assigned before D-Day become casualties. Only 36% survive their required 25 missions. And flak kills more of them than German fighters ever will. Yet, for months, senior commanders refused to authorize window despite watching the RAF cut their losses in half. The reason? Fear. Fear that using it would teach the Germans the secret. Fear that the Luftwaffe would copy the technique and use it against London. Fear that revealing American knowledge of German radar frequencies would compromise intelligence sources. So crews kept dying while bundles of aluminum strips sat in warehouses, waiting for permission that wouldn't come until the calculus of casualties finally exceeded the calculus of fear. The ground beneath Callahan's boots doesn't care about institutional caution or strategic calculations. It only records the names of young men who flew into radar-directed fire without the one countermeasure that could have saved them. What changed between July and December? Between British success and American authorization? The answer lies not in technical innovation or battlefield necessity, but in the grinding mathematics of death rates that finally made caution more deadly than revelation. The briefing room at Pine Tree, 8th Air Force Headquarters, carried the particular silence of men making calculations that would determine who lived and who died. Major General Frederick Anderson stood before a wall map of Germany, studying red pins that marked targets and black pins that marked losses, trying to find patterns in the chaos of strategic bombing. October 1943 had been a month that shattered assumptions about American air power. Schweinfurt, Black Thursday. 60 bombers lost in a single mission. Nearly 600 men missing, captured, or dead. The kind of casualty rate that would get a ground commander relieved, except this was happening in the air where losses seemed abstract until you multiplied the numbers by 10-man crews. Anderson pulled the latest operational analysis report from his briefcase. The 8th Air Force Operational Research Section didn't deal in optimism or propaganda. They dealt in numbers, and the numbers were devastating. From June through September 1944, between 3,360 and 4,453 bombers returned with flak damage every single month, double the damage rate from the entire first year of operations. The 60-gun target of a year ago now bristled with 300 guns, and German flak batteries were getting better at their job with every passing week. More important than raw numbers was the distribution of how crews died. Analysis of 1,117 battle casualties between June and November showed a truth that contradicted every pre-war doctrine about strategic bombing. Flak wounds represented 88% of fatal casualties among examined bodies. Not fighter attacks, not mechanical failure, radar-directed anti-aircraft fire from guns that crews couldn't outmaneuver and couldn't fight back against. The RAF's been using window since July, Colonel Curtis LeMay observed, his voice carrying the flat tone of a man who'd watched too many aircraft fail to return. Their loss rates dropped immediately. Hamburg, Dresden, the whole campaign. Radar-guided searchlights wandering aimlessly, flak firing blind. 40,000 civilians dead, and they only lost 12 bombers on the first night. Anderson knew the statistics. Everyone in the room knew them. RAF Bomber Command had dropped window during Operation Gomorrah, and German air defences had collapsed like a house with its foundation removed. For one glorious week, British bombers had owned the night sky while Luftwaffe night fighters flew uselessly through clouds of false radar echoes. And 6 weeks later, the Luftwaffe was using it against London. Air Vice Marshal Sholto Douglas pointed out, the British officers' presence at American headquarters reflected the integrated nature of the combined bomber offensive, but his tone carried the weight of defending decisions made by people who understood the double-edged nature of new technology. Professor Lindemann warned us this would happen. Release the secret, and the enemy copies it within weeks. The Germans are using Duppel now, exactly as predicted. Their raids during Operation Steinbock proved it works just as well for them as for us. LeMay's jaw tightened. How many of our crews died while we sat on this technology because we were worried the Germans might use it against cities they're already bombing? London survived the Blitz. Our boys aren't surviving the flak. The mathematics of the argument were inescapable. German bombers in 1944 lacked the numbers to threaten British cities the way the Luftwaffe had in 1940. Even with Duppel, German raids remained nuisance attacks that killed hundreds rather than the tens of thousands that strategic bombing doctrine envisioned. The threat to London was theoretical. The threat to American bomber crews was catastrophically real. Anderson spread photographs across the conference table. Aircraft with wings torn off by 88mm shells. Fuselages shredded by fragmentation patterns that looked like metal confetti. B-24 seconds that had absorbed hundreds of hits and somehow stayed airborne long enough to crash land in England, their crews evacuated through holes large enough to walk through. The operational analysis section ran the numbers on defensive measures. Anderson continued. Formation changes, altitude variations, evasive maneuvers. Everything we've tried reduces losses by single-digit percentages. Window cut, RAF, losses by 50% overnight. Because German radar can't distinguish aluminum strips from aircraft, Douglas added. The Würzburg system that directs their flak is particularly vulnerable. Short wavelength means short strips, which fall slowly and create long-lasting clouds. And because Würzburg uses conical scanning with rotating polarization, it's affected by strips regardless of orientation. The technical explanation mattered less than the operational reality. British scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment had solved the basic physics years ago. Joan Curran, a Welsh physicist, had worked out the optimal dimensions: 27 centimeters by 2 centimeters, black paper backed with aluminum foil, packed in 1-pound bundles. Simple enough that a child could understand the principle. Effective enough that radar became temporarily useless when the aluminum strips filled the air. But simplicity and effectiveness didn't overcome institutional caution. The same voices that had predicted disaster if Britain used window were now explaining why America shouldn't. The same fears about revealing radar knowledge, compromising intelligence sources, and arming the enemy with new techniques now applied with even greater weight because the Germans already knew the secret. "Sir," a young operations analyst named Captain Robert Harrison spoke up from the back of the room. "I've been tracking German Flak battery deployments since January. They've added 1,500 heavy batteries in the past 10 months. The targets we're hitting now have 3 times the anti-aircraft coverage they had at the start of the year." Harrison stepped forward and overlaid a transparency on the situation map. Red zones bloomed across Germany's industrial heartland like a spreading disease. Every major target is becoming a fortress. Leuna has 500 heavy guns. The Ruhr Valley is one continuous flak belt. And they're getting better at predicted barrage fire. They don't need to see us anymore. They just need to know our altitude and heading. Anderson studied the overlay with the grim recognition of a man watching a losing strategy play out in real time. The pre-war doctrine of daylight precision bombing had assumed that massed defensive firepower from flying fortresses and liberators would be sufficient to ward off enemy fighters. It had never seriously considered what would happen when formations flew through fields of radar-directed anti-aircraft fire so dense that evasion became mathematically impossible. "The British proved window works," LeMay said quietly. "They proved the Germans would copy it, which they did. So now we're in a situation where the enemy has the countermeasure, and we're still dying without it. That's not caution. That's stupidity." The silence that followed carried the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone, crews that had died in September and October and November, while aluminum strips sat unused in storage, depots. Young men who'd followed procedures perfectly and died anyway because the procedures didn't account for technology that existed but remained forbidden. "General Arnold wants a recommendation by week's end," Anderson said finally. "The loss rates are unsustainable. We're losing airframes faster than factories can replace them, and crews faster than training schools can produce them. If we continue current operations without window, the 8th Air Force will cease to be combat effective by spring." The mathematics were that simple and that terrible. Continue refusing to use a proven countermeasure, and the strategic bombing campaign would collapse under the weight of its own casualties. Authorize window, and accept that the technology would be used against Allied cities by an enemy that already possessed it anyway. Douglas gathered his papers with the careful precision of a man who'd made similar calculations for the RAF 6 months earlier. "I'll tell you what happened in Britain. Lindemann argued against window for 2 years. Fighter Command and Anti-Aircraft Command convinced the Air Ministry to suppress it. Then the casualty rates hit the point where caution became indistinguishable from sending crews to their deaths." "When did that happen?" Harrison asked. "When we realized that fear of what the Germans might do was less important than what they were already doing. Hamburg burned, but our bomber crews came home. That's the choice. Use every advantage we have, or watch good men die while the advantage sits unused." Anderson made a note on his briefing pad. The decision would ultimately be made by Arnold and the combined chiefs of staff, but the recommendation would come from this room, from these officers who'd watched the losses mount and calculated the odds of survival for crews facing their next mission. "We'll start with limited deployment," Anderson decided. "Lead bombers in each group will carry window. Deployment will begin approximately 60 miles from target to jam short-range Würzburg radar-controlling flak and night fighters. We'll evaluate effectiveness after the first 5 missions and adjust doctrine based on results." LeMay nodded slowly. "The crews need to know why we waited so long. They need to understand that we're not just throwing aluminum foil at the problem because we're desperate. They need the whole story." "Tell them the truth," Douglas suggested. "Tell them that every war involves trade-offs between operational security and operational necessity. Tell them that the balance shifted when German flak batteries became the primary threat to bomber survival. Tell them that window won't eliminate losses, but it will give them better odds than they've had since they started flying over the Reich." Harrison pulled out his analysis folder, already thinking about the training requirements and deployment logistics. We'll need to brief crews on proper deployment techniques, bundle size, deployment timing, chute placement. The RAF learned through trial and error. We can skip that phase. The meeting adjourned with the mechanical efficiency of military planning, but everyone in the room understood what the decision meant. Somewhere in England, young men were preparing for missions that would take them into the sky over Germany. Some of them would die despite window, but more of them would come home because of it. The question that haunted Anderson as he walked back to his office wasn't about technology or tactics. It was about the crews who died in the months between British success with window and American authorization. The mathematics were clean, the loss rates were documented, the cause of death was established, but no amount of analysis could answer the question that survivors would ask for the rest of their lives. How many didn't come home because caution took precedence over the technology that could have saved them? Technical Sergeant Mike Callahan had been flying combat missions long enough to recognize the particular tone that meant something important was about to be announced. The briefing room at Mendlesham held 350 men, bombardiers and navigators and radio operators and gunners, all wearing the 1,000-yard stare that came from too many hours over hostile territory. Colonel James M. Stewart stood at the podium, and despite his Hollywood fame, nobody was starstruck. Stewart had earned their respect by flying the missions with them, by understanding that a movie star's name didn't make Flak any less deadly or enemy fighters any less determined. "Gentlemen," Stewart began, his voice carrying the flat Midwestern accent that sounded strange, coming from a man they'd seen on screen 100 times. "Starting with tomorrow's mission to Bremen, we're introducing a new defensive measure that the British have been using since July." The room stirred with interest. Anything new meant change, and change meant someone had noticed that current tactics weren't working. Callahan leaned forward, watching Stewart pull back a canvas tarp to reveal stacks of brown paper bundles. "This is window, British code name for what amounts to strips of aluminum-backed paper cut to specific dimensions that correspond to German radar wavelengths. When deployed in sufficient quantity, these strips create false echoes on enemy radar screens, rendering their systems temporarily useless for directing flak fire. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this." Stewart let that sink in for a moment before continuing. "The RAF has been using this since Operation Gomorrah in July. Their loss rates from radar-directed flak dropped by approximately 50% in the first week of deployment. German radar operators reported that their screens filled with echoes representing roughly 700 false targets for every actual bomber." Lieutenant James Walsh, Callahan's bombardier, raised his hand. "Sir, if this has been working since July, why are we just getting it now in December?" The question hung in the air like cordite smoke. Stewart's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested he'd been waiting for someone to ask. "That's a fair question, and you deserve an honest answer. The British developed window in 1942. Scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment proved it worked. But Professor Lindemann, the government's chief scientific advisor, pointed out that if we used it, the Germans would copy it, and they did. 6 weeks after Hamburg, the Luftwaffe was dropping Dupel, their version of window, during raids on London. So we didn't use it because we were worried about giving the Germans ideas?" Sergeant Tom Bradley asked from the back row, his voice carrying an edge that suggested he already knew he wouldn't like the answer. "The concern was operational security versus operational necessity," Stewart replied. "Using window meant revealing our knowledge of German radar frequencies and our capability to jam them. Intelligence sources could be compromised. German raids on Britain could become more effective." Callahan watched his crew members exchange glances. They were calculating the same mathematics he was. Months of missions, hundreds of aircraft lost, thousands of crewmen missing or dead, all while a countermeasure existed that could have cut those losses in half. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" Callahan found himself standing, surprising himself with his own boldness. Stewart nodded. Granted. Sir, I've flown 23 missions. I've seen aircraft break apart from flak hits. I've watched good crews go down because 88mm shells found them during bomb runs when we couldn't maneuver. If this technology existed and worked, how many of those crews might still be alive if we'd used it sooner? The silence that followed was absolute. Every man in the room was thinking about friends who hadn't made it back. Empty bunks, personal effects shipped home to families. Replacement crews arriving with fresh faces that would age a decade during their first mission over Germany. Stewart's response came slowly, measured. I can't answer that question, Sergeant. Nobody can. What I can tell you is that the decision to withhold window until December was made by people who had to balance multiple factors. British cities versus American bomber crews. Intelligence security versus operational effectiveness. The fear that using new technology would accelerate an arms race in electronic warfare. And now? Walsh pressed. What changed? The mathematics changed, Stewart replied bluntly. From June through September this year, we've had between 3,000 and 4,000 bombers return with flak damage every single month. That's double our entire first year of operations. The targets you're hitting now have 3 times the anti-aircraft guns they had 12 months ago. And analysis of casualties shows that 88% of fatal wounds come from flak, not fighters. He gestured toward the bundles of window. The Germans already know about this technology. They're using it. The strategic balance has shifted to where not using our own countermeasures is getting more crews killed than using them would. That's what changed. Callahan sat down slowly, processing the implications. The technology had existed, the effectiveness had been proven, but institutional caution had delayed deployment until the casualty rates became unacceptable. How many missions had he flown without window that could have been safer? How many close calls could have been avoided? Here's how this works, Stewart continued, moving past the uncomfortable questions to the practical implementation. Lead bombardiers in each squadron will carry approximately 1 pound of window strips. These bundles will be deployed through the flare chute beginning 60 miles from the target and continuing at 1 bundle per minute until bombs away. He held up a single strip, letting it catch the light. Each strip is 27 centimeters long by 2 centimeters wide. The length is exactly half the wavelength of German Würzburg radar. When these strips fall through the air, they resonate with radar signals and create echoes that appear identical to aircraft returns. How many strips in a bundle? Someone asked. Approximately 2,200. When deployed by multiple aircraft across a formation, you create a cloud of false targets that overwhelms German radar operators. Their screens fill with echoes. Their predicted barrage fire becomes random. Their radar-directed searchlights wander aimlessly because they can't distinguish real bombers from aluminum strips. Stewart pulled back another tarp, revealing photographs from RAF missions. German flak bursting at wrong altitudes. Searchlights sweeping empty sky. Damage assessments showing dramatic reductions in aircraft losses on missions where window had been properly deployed. The British learned through experience. We're learning from their experience. Deployment timing is critical. Too early, and the strips disperse before you reach the target. Too late, and the flak batteries have already locked onto your formation. 60 miles gives you the right balance. What about German countermeasures? Lieutenant Richard Morrison asked. If they've had 6 months to study this, they must have developed ways to defeat it. They have, Stewart acknowledged. The Luftwaffe developed something called wild sow, or wild boar tactics. Ground controllers direct single-seat fighters toward areas where window concentrations are highest, then let the pilots visually acquire targets against fires and searchlights below. Some German fighters carry Fug 350 Naxos radar detectors that home in on our H2S navigation radar emissions. He paused, letting them absorb the tactical reality. But here's what matters. Even with German countermeasures, RAF loss rates remain significantly lower than they were before window. The technology doesn't make you invulnerable. It changes the odds from unacceptable to survivable. Callahan understood the distinction. Window wasn't a magic shield that made Flak harmless. It was a tool that disrupted the mathematical precision of radar-directed fire. German gunners would still shoot, shells would still explode, aircraft would still be damaged, and crews would still die. But more crews would come home. One more thing, Stewart added, his voice taking on the weight of command authority. Some of you are angry that this technology was withheld for months while crews died. That anger is understandable. But channel it into using window effectively. Learn the procedures. Deploy it correctly. Give yourselves and your squadron mates the best possible odds of survival. The briefing continued with technical details about bundle preparation, chute deployment, and coordination with other aircraft. But Callahan's mind kept returning to the central question that Stewart hadn't been able to answer. How many crews had died while the countermeasure sat unused? The mathematics were documented in operational reports and casualty statistics. The technology existed in proven, tested form. The effectiveness had been demonstrated beyond doubt. Yet institutional fear of giving the enemy new capabilities had outweighed the certainty that American crews were dying at rates that threatened the entire strategic bombing campaign. Later that evening, Callahan sat in the NCO club, nursing a beer that tasted like metal and thinking about probability. 23 missions completed, 7 more to reach 30 and rotation home. Each mission was a separate roll of dice against overwhelming odds, and anything that improved those odds mattered more than questions about why it had taken so long. Sergeant Bradley dropped into the seat across from him, his expression reflecting the same calculations every combat crewman made constantly. "You think this window stuff really works?" "The British numbers say it does," Callahan replied. 50% reduction in flak losses. That's the difference between 77% casualties and something approaching survivable odds. Should have had it months ago. Callahan drained his beer, the taste of aluminum strips somehow appropriate. "But we've got it now. That has to count for something." Bradley stared at his own drink, seeing something beyond the amber liquid. "My crew on the Bremen raid in September. Direct hit from an 88 during the bomb run. Aircraft broke apart in 3 seconds. Nobody got out. If we'd had window, then—" "Don't," Callahan interrupted. "Don't play that game. You'll drive yourself crazy with what-ifs. Focus on tomorrow's mission, and the ones after. Use every advantage we've got and don't waste energy on what might have been." But even as he said it, Callahan knew the question would haunt every survivor. The crews who'd made it through would always wonder about the ones who hadn't. The mathematical certainty that window could have changed outcomes would remain an uncomfortable truth that no amount of tactical analysis could resolve. Tomorrow they'd fly to Bremen again. Lead bombardiers would deploy window bundles through flare chutes. German radar operators would see their screens fill with false echoes. Flak would fire blind instead of with mathematical precision. And if the British statistics held true, more American crews would come home than would have without it. That was all that mattered now, not the institutional decisions that had delayed deployment, not the uncomfortable calculations about preventable casualties, just the mission ahead and the narrow margins between survival and death that new technology might widen by a few crucial degrees. Callahan finished his beer and headed back to his barracks, already mentally preparing for the briefing that would come at 0400 hours. Another mission over Germany, another bomb run through radar-directed flak, another roll of dice against overwhelming odds. But this time, the odds would be slightly better than they'd been the day before. And in a war where survival margins measured in single-digit percentages, slightly better was the difference between coming home and not coming home at all. December 21st, 1943, 0430 hours. The same briefing room that had held uncomfortable truths the day before now held 350 men preparing for the first American mission using window operationally. Technical Sergeant Mike Callahan watched Lead Bombardier Lieutenant James Walsh carefully pack bundles of aluminum strips into a canvas bag. Each bundle weighed exactly 1 pound. Each contained 2,200 strips of metallized paper, precisely cut to specifications that would make German Würzburg radar temporarily useless. The mission briefing had been straightforward. Bremen again. The A.G. Weser shipyards where German submarines were built, the same target they'd hit dozens of times before, except this time they'd be flying with a countermeasure that might actually work against the radar-directed flak that made the approach so deadly. Colonel Stewart had emphasized the timing. Window deployment begins at 60 miles from target. 1 bundle per minute through the flare chute. Continue deployment through bombs away. The lead aircraft in each element will carry primary responsibility, but backup bombardiers should be ready to deploy if the lead aircraft is damaged. Simple enough in theory. In practice, Walsh would be juggling window deployment while calculating bomb trajectory, monitoring the Norden bombsight, and maintaining formation discipline during the most dangerous phase of the mission. The bomb run was when German gunners had the best opportunity to hit them, when evasive maneuvers gave way to the straight and level flying that precision bombing demanded. "You nervous?" Callahan asked Walsh as they climbed aboard their B-24, tail number 42-51198, nicknamed Aluminum Overcast by a crew that appreciated irony. "Always nervous," Walsh replied, settling into the bombardier's position in the nose. "But if this window stuff works like the British claim, maybe I'll be slightly less nervous." The takeoff sequence proceeded with mechanical precision. 42 Liberators from the 392nd Bombardment Group lifting into December darkness, climbing through cloud layers that turned their exhaust trails into ghostly streamers. They assembled over the Buncher 6 radio beacon, forming up into the combat box formation that would carry them across the North Sea toward Germany. Callahan checked his ammunition. The twin 50 caliber machine guns in the waist position were his responsibility, and he'd learned that mechanical reliability mattered more than aggressive firing. Conserve ammunition. Pick targets carefully. Don't waste rounds on fighters beyond effective range. The formation crossed the English coast at 0615, flying at 23,000 feet where the temperature was 40 degrees below zero and oxygen masks became matters of life and death. Below them, the North Sea stretched to the horizon, grey and hostile and utterly unforgiving to crews forced to ditch when fuel or battle damage made England unreachable. Pilot to crew, enemy coast in sight. Test fire all guns. Callahan opened up with a short burst, watching tracers arc into empty sky. The guns functioned perfectly, their mechanical reliability a small comfort against the chaos that would begin when they reached the target area. At 0745, Walsh's voice crackled through the intercom. "Bombardier to pilot, approaching window deployment point. Estimate 60 miles to target. Roger, Bombardier. Deploy at your discretion." Callahan watched Walsh tear open the first canvas bundle and shove it through the flare chute. 2,200 aluminum strips tumbled into the slipstream, separating and spreading across several cubic miles of frozen German sky. Each strip caught the morning sunlight, creating a brief sparkle like metal confetti before the formation left them behind. On German radar screens 60 miles away, operators watching the approaching American formation suddenly saw their displays fill with echoes. The tight blip representing Aluminum Overcast and her squadron mates dissolved into a cloud of returns that looked exactly like 700 additional aircraft. Hauptmann Werner Schmidt commanded the Würzburg radar station directing flak batteries around Bremen. He'd been tracking the American formation since they crossed the coast, providing precise altitude and heading data that let gun crews set fuses and calculate lead angles with mathematical precision. The Americans flew predictable courses. Their formations were tight and disciplined. Given accurate radar data, his guns could put shells within 50 meters of the bombers every time. Then his screen became useless. "What is this?" Schmidt demanded, watching the single formation blip fracture into hundreds of scattered returns. "Equipment failure? All systems nominal, Herr Hauptmann," his operator reported. "But we're seeing massive returns across the entire approach corridor. It looks like the British," Schmidt interrupted, understanding suddenly what he was seeing. "They're using Duppel. The Americans have finally adopted it." He'd been briefed on the British countermeasure. Aluminum strips cut to radar wavelength, creating false echoes that overwhelmed detection systems. The Luftwaffe had captured samples during RAF raids and reverse-engineered the concept, producing their own version for use against British radar. Now the Americans were using it, and Schmidt's carefully calibrated gun-laying data had just become useless. "Switch to predicted barrage," he ordered. "Last known heading and altitude. Fire pattern Delta 7 across probable approach corridor. Without radar guidance, the gun crews would be shooting blind. They could still put shells in the air based on the formation's last known position and standard approach patterns, but the mathematical precision that had made German flak so deadly was gone. Now it became a matter of probability rather than certainty, of saturating probable flight paths rather than targeting specific aircraft. Aboard aluminum overcast, the change was immediately noticeable. The flak that had been bracketing their formation with disturbing accuracy suddenly became random. Black puffs of smoke appeared at wrong altitudes, exploding where they'd been 30 seconds ago, rather than where they were now. The characteristic pattern of predicted fire, where shells arrived in groups of 4, precisely positioned around the formation, gave way to scattered bursts that looked menacing but lacked the concentrated lethality of radar-directed fire. "They're shooting blind," Callahan observed over the intercom. "Windows actually working." Walsh deployed another bundle, maintaining the 1-per-minute timing that kept German radar screens saturated with false targets. The aluminum strips spread across their wake like a protective curtain, creating echoes that persisted for minutes as the strips slowly tumbled toward Earth. Bombardier to pilot. IP in sight. Beginning bomb run. The initial point marked the start of the most dangerous phase of any bombing mission. For the next 8 minutes, they would fly straight and level while Walsh synchronized the Norden bombsight with their ground track. No evasive maneuvers, no altitude changes. Just straight flying that gave German gunners their best opportunity to achieve a hit. Except the German gunners were firing blind. Flak continued to burst around the formation, close enough that Callahan could hear fragments rattling against the fuselage. But the shells that would have been deadly with radar guidance became merely frightening without it. Near misses instead of direct hits, fragments that caused damage but not catastrophic failure. "Bomb bay doors open," Walsh announced, synchronizing on target. The shipyard sprawled beneath them, grey buildings and construction slips clearly visible against the frozen landscape. Callahan could see the distinctive shapes of submarine hulls under construction, the primary reason Bremen remained such an important target, despite its formidable defences. "Bombs away!" Aluminum overcast lifted slightly as 5,000 pounds of high explosives dropped from the bomb bay. Walsh photographed the bomb impacts with the K-20 camera, capturing evidence of their attack for post-mission analysis. Around them, the rest of the formation released their loads in rippling succession, creating a pattern of explosions that walked across the shipyard complex. Pilot to crew, rally point in sight. Closing bomb bay doors. The formation began its turn away from the target, still deploying window to cover their withdrawal. German fighter attacks, predicted but not materialized during the bomb run, now developed as Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds, dove through their formation from high altitude. Callahan opened fire as a 109 flashed past, leading the target by 3 lengths and watching his tracers arc toward the enemy fighter. No hits, but enough to discourage a second pass. Around him, other gunners maintained a steady rate of fire, creating interlocking fields of fire that made close passes suicidally dangerous for German pilots. The fighters broke off after 20 minutes, their fuel state and ammunition expenditure forcing them to return to base. The American formation continued west, gradually losing altitude as they approached the coast and the relative safety of fighter escort from P-47 Thunderbolts operating at their maximum range. They crossed the English coast at 09:55, 3 hours and 40 minutes after takeoff. Every aircraft that had reached the target area was returning, though several trailed smoke from flak damage, and one was flying on 3 engines after taking a direct hit to the No. 2 power plant. Aluminum overcast touched down at Mendlesham with 117 holes from flak fragments, substantially fewer than the 347 from the previous mission to the same target. More importantly, the holes were scattered randomly rather than concentrated in the tight patterns that indicated radar-directed fire. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, counting damage and preparing it for the next mission. Colonel Stewart appeared on the flight line, personally debriefing crews about window effectiveness and German responses. They switched to predicted barrage fire. Walsh reported, "Lost the tight bracketing. Pattern about 90 seconds after I started deploying. Still plenty of flak, but it was shooting where we'd been instead of where we were." Stewart made notes on his briefing board. Similar reports from other crews confirmed what the RAF had experienced. Window didn't eliminate flak. It made flak significantly less effective by removing the mathematical precision that radar guidance provided. The mission analysis came back within hours. Of 42 aircraft that had attacked the target, 41 returned safely. The one loss had occurred after leaving the target area when accumulated flak damage caused structural failure. Compared to previous missions to Bremen without window, where losses had averaged 4 to 6 aircraft per mission, the improvement was dramatic. But the real test would come over time, as the 8th Air Force incorporated window into standard operating procedures and as German defences adapted to the new American tactics. The evolution happened faster than anyone had predicted. Within a week, every heavy bomber group in England had adopted window as standard equipment. Lead bombardiers carried canvas bags filled with aluminum strips. Deployment procedures became routine. The sight of metallized paper tumbling from flare chutes became as normal as oxygen masks and intercom chatter. German responses evolved with equal speed. Hauptmann Werner Schmidt and his radar operators learned to track formations before they began deploying window, then use predicted courses to direct flak fire at probable locations. Wild-boar fighter tactics, developed to counter RAF night bombing, adapted to daylight operations where visual acquisition became possible against the aluminum clouds that marked American formations. The Fugue 350 Naxos radar detector, originally designed to home in on British H-2S navigation radar, found new purpose tracking American bombers that revealed their positions through window deployment. German night fighters equipped with Naxos could follow the aluminum strip clouds directly to their source, using the countermeasure as a targeting beacon rather than a defense. By January 1944, the tactical chess match had reached new complexity. American crews deployed window to blind radar. German controllers directed fighters toward window concentrations to find visual targets. American escort fighters protected the bombers from the fighters. German flak batteries fired predicted barrages at formation-sized boxes of airspace, saturating probable flight paths rather than targeting individual aircraft. And through it all, the casualty rates that had threatened to destroy the 8th Air Force's combat effectiveness began to decline. Technical Sergeant Mike Callahan flew his 30th and final mission on February 18, 1944, Berlin, the first major daylight raid on the German capital, and every crew understood the symbolic importance of attacking the Reich's political center in broad daylight. They deployed window across the entire approach, filling German radar screens with false echoes that made accurate tracking impossible. Flak burst around their formation with the usual ferocity, but the predicted barrage fire lacked the mathematical precision of radar-directed shells, near misses instead of direct hits, frightening instead of deadly. When aluminum overcast touched down at Mendlesham that evening, Callahan had logged 300 combat hours and survived odds that had killed 77% of crews who'd started when he did. 30 missions completed. Rotation orders to the United States approved. The dream of going home transformed from statistical impossibility to actual reality. Colonel Stewart met him on the flight line, shaking his hand with the formality that marked significant occasions. "Congratulations, Sergeant. You've earned your way home." "Thank you, sir." Callahan looked back at the aircraft that had carried him through 30 missions over occupied Europe. Window made the difference, didn't it? Between completing 30 missions and not making it past 15. Stewart nodded slowly. The operational analysis section ran the numbers. From December 20th through the end of January, our flak loss rate dropped 28% compared to the same targets during October and November. Not the 50% the RAF achieved, because German defences adapted faster than British defences had, but still a significant improvement in crew survival rates. 28%, Callahan repeated, doing the mathematics in his head. How many crews is that? How many guys made it home who wouldn't have without Window? Hundreds, probably thousands, over the course of the war. Window didn't eliminate losses. It changed the odds from unacceptable to survivable. That's not a small thing when you're the one facing those odds. Callahan understood the distinction. Window hadn't made him invulnerable. It had made the flak slightly less effective, which made each mission slightly more survivable, which over the course of 30 missions added up to the difference between rotation and becoming a casualty statistic. "Sir, one question, off the record." Stewart's expression suggested he knew what was coming. "Go ahead, Sergeant." "How many crews died between July, when the RAF proved Window worked, and December, when we started using it? How many guys didn't make it home because we waited 5 months to authorize a countermeasure that we knew was effective?" The silence stretched longer than combat formation timing. Stewart looked toward the operations board, where names were listed next to mission assignments, some crossed out and replaced with new names when crews didn't return. "I can't answer that question," he said finally. "Nobody can. The operational analysis section could give you casualty statistics and loss rates and probability calculations, but translating those numbers into specific faces and names? That's impossible. Some crews would have died anyway. Window reduces losses by a percentage, not absolutely. But some percentage died who might not have if we'd used Window sooner." "Yes," Stewart acknowledged. "Some percentage. The decision to withhold Window until December was made by people who had to balance multiple factors. Intelligence, security, fear of German countermeasures, concerns about revealing radar capabilities. Those weren't frivolous concerns. They were real strategic considerations. But the guys who died in October didn't care about strategic considerations, Callahan observed. They cared about coming home. They did. And so do the crews flying tomorrow's mission, and the ones after that. Window is standard equipment now. The lessons learned are incorporated into doctrine. That's how institutions evolve, Sergeant. Sometimes, slowly. Sometimes at a cost that seems unacceptable in hindsight. Callahan picked up his gear bag, preparing to leave Mendlesham, for the last time as a combat crewman. 30 missions completed. The war would continue without him, with new crews flying into the same dangers he'd faced, protected by the same aluminum strips that had helped him survive. "Thank you for the honest answer, sir. Thank you for flying 30 missions over Germany when the odds said you wouldn't make it past 15. That's what won this war, Sergeant. Not technology or tactics or strategic decisions. Courage from men who kept flying even when the mathematics said they shouldn't survive." Callahan walked toward the transport that would take him to the processing centre and eventually to a ship bound for the United States. Behind him, ground crews were already preparing aluminum overcast for tomorrow's mission. Another crew would fly her over Germany, Another bombardier would deploy window through the flare chute. Another group of young men would face flak and fighters, and the overwhelming odds of strategic bombing. But those odds would be slightly better than they'd been a year ago. Not because of courage or determination or any of the virtues that military doctrine celebrated. Because someone had finally authorized the use of technology that had existed all along. The uncomfortable truth that Callahan carried home with him was that war involved calculations where lives became variables in equations about acceptable losses and strategic trade-offs. Window had existed. Its effectiveness had been proven. But institutional caution had delayed deployment until the casualty rates made inaction more dangerous than action. How many hadn't come home because of that delay? The answer existed in casualty reports and loss statistics and operational analyses. But reducing those numbers to actual faces and names and families who received telegrams would require an accounting that the official histories would never conduct. All Callahan knew was that he'd survived. That window had helped him survive. And that somewhere in England, young men were preparing for tomorrow's mission with slightly better odds than the men who'd flown before window became standard equipment. That had to be enough. The final accounting came from sources that cared only about numbers, not politics or strategy or institutional caution. The 8th Air Force Operational Analysis Section tracked losses with mechanical precision, comparing casualty rates before and after window deployment. From June through November 1943, Flak accounted for 54% of all heavy bomber losses over Germany. Direct hits from 88mm and 105mm shells. Catastrophic damage from radar-directed predicted barrages. Accumulated fragment hits that caused structural failure. From December 1943 through May 1944, Flak still accounted for the majority of losses, but the rate decreased by 28% for missions where window was properly deployed. Not the dramatic 50% reduction that RAF Bomber Command had achieved during the Hamburg raids, because German defences adapted faster than British defences had. But still a measurable, statistically significant improvement in crew survival rates. The numbers told the story that personal accounts couldn't. Window didn't eliminate Flak. It made Flak less effective by forcing German gun crews to fire predicted barrages at probable locations, rather than radar-directed shells at specific targets. Near misses instead of direct hits. Survivable damage instead of catastrophic failure. Over the course of the strategic bombing campaign, that difference measured in hundreds of aircraft that returned which might not have. Thousands of crewmen who completed their tours and rotated home. The slow accumulation of small improvements in survival odds that determined whether the 8th Air Force remained combat effective or collapsed under unsustainable casualty rates. By November 1944, the German flak defences had become more effective than the Luftwaffe's fighter forces at shooting down Allied bombers. As German territory contracted and flak batteries concentrated around remaining industrial targets, the density of anti-aircraft fire increased, even as fighter opposition declined due to fuel shortages and pilot losses. But window remained standard equipment. Every lead bombardier carried aluminum strips. Deployment procedures were refined through operational experience, and the mathematical precision that had made German radar-directed flak so deadly in 1943 became impossible to maintain in 1944 and 45. The uncomfortable questions about delay remained unanswered. How many crews died between July, when the RAF proved window effective, and December, when the 8th Air Force authorized its use? The operational analysis reports didn't calculate that specific number, though the data existed to make estimates. What those reports did, the show was that institutional caution about revealing technology to the enemy had persisted even after the enemy possessed the technology. That strategic considerations about intelligence sources and operational security had outweighed tactical realities about crew survival rates. That the decision to withhold window until December had involved trade-offs between competing priorities where some men paid the cost for others' caution. The lesson that emerged from the analysis wasn't about technology or tactics. It was about institutions and how they balanced risk against certainty. Window represented proven technology with demonstrated effectiveness, but using it meant accepting that the enemy would copy it, which they did. The question wasn't whether German defences would adapt, but whether American crews could afford to wait until institutional caution gave way to operational necessity. The casualty statistics provided the answer. When loss rates threatened to make strategic bombing unsustainable, the mathematics of death finally exceeded the calculus of fear. Window became standard equipment not because the strategic concerns disappeared, but because continued delay guaranteed outcomes worse than the risks of deployment. Technical Sergeant Mike Callahan never saw those operational analysis reports. He was already home in Ohio by the time statisticians finished calculating survival rate improvements and loss rate reductions. But he understood the essential truth that the numbers documented. Some technology worked, some institutional decisions delayed deploying that technology, and the men who flew combat missions paid the cost of that delay with their lives. The final statistics from the war in Europe showed that at least half of all American aircraft shot down over Germany fell to flak rather than fighters. 5,380 bombers lost to anti-aircraft fire. 4,274 to fighter attacks, 2,033 to other causes. Those numbers represented more than destroyed aircraft. They represented crews of 10 men each, 53,800 casualties from flak alone. Young men who'd trained at American bases, crossed the Atlantic, and flown into skies defended by radar-directed guns that could predict their positions with mathematical precision. Window didn't save all of them. Technology never does. But it saved some percentage, and that percentage measured in hundreds or thousands of lives depending on how you calculated the statistics. The question that survivors carried home was whether that percentage could have been higher if Window had been authorized sooner. If institutional caution about revealing technology had given way to operational reality about crew survival rates in July rather than December, if the proven effectiveness of British tactics had been sufficient to overcome American fears about German countermeasures, the operational analysis reports couldn't answer those questions conclusively. They could only document what happened, calculate the improvements that Window provided, and leave to historians the uncomfortable task of determining whether the delay was justified by strategic concerns or represented institutional failure to adapt to battlefield realities. What the reports did prove beyond doubt was that sometimes saving fuel meant winning battles, and sometimes blinding radar meant surviving missions, and sometimes the simplest technology, aluminum strips falling through frozen German sky, made the difference between catastrophic losses and acceptable casualties. The crews who flew through radar-directed flak understood that lesson with absolute clarity. Every bundle of Window deployed through a flare chute was a small act of defiance against the mathematical precision of German gun-laying radar. Every false echo on enemy screens was a chance to survive one more mission, complete one more bomb run, and make it home when the Lengstvolp odds said you shouldn't. That was the real story of Window in the skies over Germany. Not grand strategy or institutional decisions, but the accumulated small advantages that determined whether young men lived or died during 7 hours over hostile territory. The technology existed, the effectiveness was proven, and eventually, when the casualties became unsustainable, the caution gave way to the certainty that doing nothing guaranteed worse outcomes than doing something. Technical Sergeant Mike Callahan lived to be 87 years old. He raised a family in Ohio, worked as a machinist for 40 years, and rarely talked about the war except when other veterans asked direct questions. But he never forgot the sight of aluminum strips tumbling from his B-24's flare chute, creating false echoes on German radar screens and giving his crew slightly better odds of survival. He never knew how many didn't come home because Window came too late. The official histories didn't calculate that specific number, and the operational analysis reports focused on measurable improvements rather than counterfactual casualties. But he knew that some did come home because Window came at all. That technology, once deployed, saved lives in ways that courage and determination alone couldn't. and that sometimes the hardest questions in war weren't about tactical execution or strategic planning, but about institutional decisions that determined when proven countermeasures became authorized equipment. The aluminum strips that saved Technical Sergeant Callahan's life weighed less than 1 ounce each. Cut to precise dimensions, deployed at calculated intervals, and scattered across German skies to create clouds of false radar echoes. Simple technology with complex implications about how wars are fought, how institutions make decisions, and how young men survive odds that mathematics say they shouldn't. That simplicity contained the story's essential truth. Sometimes the difference between life and death measured in aluminum strips falling through winter sky. Sometimes institutional caution killed more surely than enemy action. And sometimes the only question that mattered wasn't about grand strategy or operational security, but about whether the guys flying tomorrow's mission would have every advantage that technology could provide. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.